The next two tenets are flip sides of the same coin. It is a remarkable fact that while there are many living species, all of us, you, me, the elephant, and the potted cactus, share some fundamental traits. Among these are the biochemical pathways that we use to produce energy, our standard 4-letter DNA code, and how that code is read and translated into proteins. This tells us that every species goes back to a single common ancestor, an ancestor who had those common traits and passed them on to its descendants. But if evolution meant only gradual genetic change within a species, we'd have only one species today, a single, highly evolved descendant of the first species. Yet we have many. Well over 10 million species inhabit our planet today, and we know of a further 250,000 as fossils. Life is diverse. How does this diversity arise from one ancestral form? This requires the third idea of evolution, that of splitting, or more accurately, speciation. Figure 1 shows a sample evolutionary tree that illustrates the relationships between birds and reptiles. We've all seen these, but let's examine one a bit more closely to understand what it really means. What exactly happened when node X, say, split into the lineage that leads to modern reptiles like lizards and snakes on the one hand, and to modern birds and their dinosaurian relatives on the other? Node X represents a single ancestral species, an ancient reptile, that split into two descendant species. One of the descendants went on its own merry path, eventually splitting many times and giving rise to all dinosaurs and modern birds. The other descendant did the same, but produced most modern reptiles. The common ancestor X is often called the missing link between the descendant groups. It is the genealogical connection between birds and modern reptiles, the intersection you'd finally reach if you trace their lineages all the way back. There's a more recent missing link here too, Node Y, the species that was the common ancestor of bipedal meat-eating dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex, all now extinct, and modern birds. But although common ancestors are no longer with us, and their fossils nearly impossible to document, after all, they represent but a single species out of thousands in the fossil record, we can sometimes discover fossils closely related to them, species having features that show common ancestry. In the next chapter, for example, we'll learn about the feathered dinosaurs that support the existence of Node Y. What happened when ancestor X split into two separate species? Nothing much, really. As we'll see later, speciation simply means the evolution of different groups that can't interbreed. That is, groups that can't exchange genes. What we would have seen had we been around when this common ancestor began to split is simply two populations of a single reptilian species, probably living in different places, beginning to evolve slight differences from each other. Over a long time, these differences gradually grew larger. Eventually, the two populations would have evolved sufficient genetic differences that members of the different populations could not interbreed. Millions of years later, and after more splitting events, one of the descendant dinosaur species, Node Y, itself split into two more species, one eventually producing all the bipedal carnivorous dinosaurs, and the other producing all living birds. This critical moment in evolutionary history, the birth of the ancestor of all birds, wouldn't have looked so dramatic at the time. We wouldn't have seen the sudden appearance of flying creatures from reptiles, but merely two slightly different populations of the same dinosaur, probably no more different than members of diverse human populations are today. All the important change occurred thousands of generations after the split, when selection acted on one lineage to promote flight and on the other to promote the traits of bipedal dinosaurs. It is only in retrospect that we can identify species Y as the common ancestor of T. rex and birds. These evolutionary events were slow, and seem momentous only when we arrange in sequence all the descendants of these diverging evolutionary streams. Speciation doesn't happen very often, but each time one species splits into two, it doubles the number of opportunities for future speciation. So the number of species can rise exponentially. Although speciation is slow, it happens sufficiently often over such long periods of history that it can easily explain the stunning diversity of living plants and animals on Earth. It stands to reason that if the history of life forms a tree, with all species originating from a single trunk, then one can find a common origin for every pair of twigs, existing species, by tracing each twig back through its branches until they intersect at the branch they have in common. This node, as we've seen, is their common ancestor. And if life began with one species and split into millions of